And now on to the next musical example, the organ fugue in G minor, also known as the Little Fugue by Johann Sebastian Bach. This piece was written in 1709 during Bach's tenure as a church organist. He wrote many organ works, most of them for the churches that he worked at, but he was an organist, so of course he performed most of these works as well. The Little Fugue is one of hundreds of fugues that Bach wrote during his lifetime, and it's actually a very short fugue. Most of the ones he wrote had a beginning section called a prelude that led into the fugue, which was a longer composition. So you lucked out and you only have to listen to a 3.5-minute example of a fugue this time. But it is a great example of a fugue. This particular piece of music is so popular, it's been arranged over the last few hundred years in many ways, including for choir or orchestra. So what exactly is a fugue? You've read about a fugue, and now you've heard one and seen one in the graphic scoring, but let me talk a little bit about what it actually is. A fugue is a form of Baroque music that is polyphonic and is based on one main theme called a subject. There are lots of words in the Baroque for melody, and this is yet another one. The subject is the melody that begins a fugue. That melody, that subject, is imitated over and over at different pitch levels throughout the fugue. The fugue usually has 3 or 4 voices. They're called voices even though they're played by instruments. But basically it simply means that the fugue has a subject that is imitated at different pitch levels. A fugue can be written for any different instrument. It can be written for multiple instruments or one at a time. But the most important thing to know is this idea that the subject is repeated at various points throughout the piece. What makes the fugue polyphonic is the fact that the other melodies are used along with that subject, and the subject itself becomes a secondary melody. That secondary melody is called an answer. So first you have a subject, a melody, that is stated. Once that melody has been stated, it moves to a new key and is restated. Remember that we have a home key, you modulate, and you move to a new key. When that happens in a fugue, the subject is now called an answer because it's answering what has come before it. A counter subject is when a statement of the second melody is heard while the subject is playing. So in other words, when you are hearing a fugue and you hear the subject, but underneath it you hear other material, that other material, that secondary melody, is a counter subject. And remember, polyphony is when you have 2 melodies sounding at the same time. In between every time that a subject is heard in a fugue, you have what are called episodes. That's when you have new material in between each subject. So when you were listening to your fugue earlier, you heard a statement of the melody, the subject. Then you heard some new interesting material that was just kind of fun to listen to and fast. Then you heard the subject again in a new key. That was the answer. After that, you again heard some new material that was transitioning into another statement of the subject. We'll listen to it again and I'll point those moments out to you. Here's a few really cool techniques that are used to create contrast in a fugue. You have the melody, also known as the subject. In this case, I've written out a melody for you that goes up and then falls down. An inversion is when you take something and you flip it upside down. So then you see that the melody first goes down and then up. A retrograde is when a melody is played backwards. So if you look at the first note of the melody, the subject, it is the last note of the retrograde version, and that follows the backwards pattern. Augmentation and diminution are 2 techniques where you play the subject, but you play it at twice the rhythm, or you play it at half the rhythm. So basically it takes twice as long to play, or it takes half as much time to play. These are simply ideas to create contrast without changing the subject. It's a way to create contrast, but also still maintain unity. So let's listen to a little bit of our fugue, shall we? that is our first subject, and where I stopped it was when the secondary subject comes in a different key, or in other words, the answer is heard. While the answer is playing, you hear other material. That other material is new material, and it's known as the counter subject. This is the beginning of the polyphony, because you have two voices playing two melodies at the same time. Did you hear how at the end of that, all of a sudden the music was new and different? Bach was changing keys, and so he created an episode that was a transitional area in the music leading into the entrance of the third subject. Obviously, there's a repeating melody in this piece, and there's a use of different keys modulating between majors and minors, happy and sad key areas. Bach uses those for contrast, but yet we hear zero dynamic changes. The organ really isn't capable at this point of creating dynamic changes, and since that's something that is a part of Baroque characteristics and the use of the dynamic element, it's something we should expect from music like this. The texture is obviously from the late Baroque period, as we've talked about. The melody is repeated for unity of mood, as are the rhythms. So this is very characteristic of Baroque church music. Now it's time to move on to the next listening example. The next listening example is number 4. It's a trio sonata in A minor, opus number 3, number 10, by Arcangelo Corelli. You know who Corelli is, but we need to learn a little bit more about his actual style of writing music. When you're listening to the example, think about how many instruments you hear playing. How is this different from a concerto grosso and the fugue you just listened to? And can you hear any specific Baroque qualities to the music that make it stand out as a Baroque piece of music?